Why was everyone staring at her before she even stepped off the Osprey? The rotors screamed against the thin mountain air, slicing through clouds of ochre dust that turned the world into a blinding storm. Through that haze, she appeared, boots hitting the ramp in steady rhythm, a slim figure carrying a hard, gray Pelican case that seemed far too clean for this place. Forward Operating Base Nightingale wasn't much of a base. It was a wound carved into the Hindu Kush, a scatter of sand-colored tents, diesel drums, and the stink of sweat and cordite. Every wall bore scars, bullet holes patched with tape, HESCO barriers bleached and bloodstained by a sun that didn't forgive. And every set of eyes turned toward her. To them she didn't belong. She was too quiet, too composed. The soldiers shuffling through the heat had that thousand-yard stare, ghosts in armor. She had none of that, only precision. Her boots clicked cleanly on the metal plates, no dust on her sleeves, no weapon on her shoulder. Just the case. Then he stepped forward. A shadow detached from the group of men lounging against an armored MRAP. Broad shoulders, close-cropped hair, the jaw of someone who fought the mountain itself and probably won. His gaze was sharp, predatory, dismissive, the kind that weighed someone and filed them under liability. "You the data witch from Langley." His voice carried easily, low and graveled. She met it with the calm of someone who'd been underestimated her whole life. "I'm the analyst assigned to this operation." Her voice was clear, level, no nerves, no fear. The man gave a short, humorless laugh. His men, SEALs by their gear, by that smug casual lethality that never needed announcing, chuckled with him. "Analyst, huh? Colonel Rostova's pet project," he smirked. "She thinks you're gonna find the ghost of Kandahar with a spreadsheet." He didn't even wait for an answer, just gestured toward the command tent. "She's waiting. Try not to trip over your own feet, librarian." And as he walked away, he muttered loud enough for his team to hear, and for her to hear too. "Can you believe it? They sent us a librarian to hunt a ghost." She said nothing. She just adjusted the Pelican case in her grip and kept walking. The laughter followed her like gunfire. Inside the command tent, the air was thick with maps and tension. Every surface was covered in strategy, routes, patterns, circles drawn in red. In the center, standing tall and severe as steel, was Colonel Eva Rostova, a woman whose posture alone could hold a mission together. "Ms. Vance," Rostova said crisply, "welcome to the furnace." Her accent was faint, Russian maybe, but her eyes were pure calculation. "You've met Lieutenant Commander Thorne," she continued. "Don't mind him. He and his team believe in kinetic solutions. Data makes them nervous." "I'm aware of the culture, Colonel," Aara replied, setting her case on the table. She opened it, not a laptop but a hardened military terminal, the kind of device designed for war zones and secrets. "Fear of the unknown," she murmured, "is a powerful motivator, and a fatal one." Rostova's eyebrow lifted, but she didn't interrupt. Thorne's team had been chasing a phantom for months, an insurgent leader known only as the Ghost, 3 of their men dead. No pattern, no trail, chaos. But Aara didn't see chaos. Her fingers danced across the keyboard, pulling up a topographical map overlaid with shimmering lines of data. "He's not random," she said softly. "He's mathematical. He uses terrain blind spots, solar glare, and our own patrol schedules against us. He's predictable." That was when the tent flap flew open. Thorne strode in, jaw tight, eyes full of fury. His team followed, living proof of the mountain's cruelty, each man carved from exhaustion and pride. "Predictable," he barked. "Lady, I've been in this valley 6 months. The only predictable thing here is that good men die." "These aren't ghosts, Commander," Aara replied, her tone steady. She zoomed in on a narrow canyon marked the Serpent's Tooth. "This is probability. Based on his patterns, aversion to civilian zones, and vegetation displacement, there's a 94.7% chance his next cache is here. And 3 hours ago, a Reaper drone went down less than 5 clicks from that point." He scoffed. Vegetation displacement. You're tracking a warlord using satellite pictures of bushes. The algorithm tracks deviations, she said calmly. Those bushes tell me 12 men passed through carrying heavy loads within 48 hours. Your numbers won't stop bullets, he growled. They might stop your men from walking into another ambush. For a second, just one, silence filled the tent. Then Rostova spoke. Thorn, you'll take a small recovery element, 2 vehicles, retrieve the drone core. Ms. Vance goes with you. The silence that followed was suffocating. Thorn turned, disbelief twisting into rage. You're joking. We're taking her out there. What's she gonna do when the bullets start flying? Recalculate trajectories. Aara met his stare without blinking. The drone's core has a thermite failsafe. If handled wrong, it incinerates itself. I'm the only one on this continent who can disarm it. Fine, he snapped. You want to play soldier. You breathe when I tell you to breathe. You twitch without my say-so. I chain you to the bumper. Clear. Crystal Commander. He stormed out, his men trailing him like wolves. Rostova watched them go, then turned back to Aara. You're sure about this? Once you leave the wire, you're in his world. Aara's voice softened just a shade. I'm not afraid of RPGs, Colonel. I'm afraid of incomplete data. She closed her terminal and walked out into the sunlight. The convoy rolled through the valley, 2 matte black MRAPs grinding their way over shattered earth. Inside the lead vehicle, the air was thick with silence. Aara sat in the back, squeezed between 2 walls of muscle. Neither man looked at her. To them she was excess weight. Thorn rode shotgun, eyes fixed on the horizon, hand on his rifle. She focused on her tablet. The screen flickered with shifting readings, barometric pressure, heat gradients, magnetic drift. To the SEALs, it was meaningless noise. To her, it was a language. 5 minutes to Serpent's Tooth, the driver called. Kill the chatter, Thorn ordered, eyes open. Aara's head lifted slightly. Her eyes moved left, right, scanning data only she could interpret. Commander, she said quietly, we need to stop. Thorn turned annoyed. We stop when we reach the objective, analyst, not before. Her eyes didn't waver. Thermal anomaly on the southern ridge, 400 meters ahead, consistent with multiple disturbed heat points, could be an IED cluster. Lady, the man beside her, Grizz, snorted. The whole country's a thermal anomaly. It's 110 in the shade. This pattern is too deliberate, she insisted. Uniform spacing. Your second vehicle's comms just dropped 12 decibels. Their biometrics are spiking. They're nervous. Thorn stared at her, torn between anger and doubt. She was so damn sure, too sure. He hesitated, and in that hesitation, a flicker of instinct told him she wasn't wrong. Fine, he growled. All elements halt, scan the ridge. Engines idled. Silence pressed in. For a full minute, nothing moved but dust. Then Grizz smirked. See, nothing. The world exploded. A titanic blast tore through the ground, flipping the 20-ton MRAP like a toy. Metal screamed. Fire roared. Aara was thrown against the ceiling, then slammed to the floor, lungs crushed by the shockwave. When she came to, the world was red, the air thick with smoke, blood, and the smell of burning oil. Grizz screamed, his leg a mess of shrapnel and blood. The driver was gone, just gone. Outside, the second vehicle was a funeral pyre. RPGs rained from the ridges above. Machine gun fire shredded the sand and steel around them. They were caught, ambushed. The kill box Thorn had sworn he'd never enter. Chaos consumed everything, until a single calm voice cut through the roar. Pressure. Aara's tone was sharp, surgical. She was already at Grizz's side, cinching a tourniquet with a torn belt and a spent magazine. Now, press here, hard. Thorn, blood dripping into his eyes, froze mid-motion. He watched her move, efficient, precise. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't even breathing hard. Diaz, she barked, turning to the youngest SEAL firing blindly out a shattered port. Stop wasting ammo. Ridge 2 o'clock, controlled bursts 10 rounds. Make them count. Her voice cut through fear like a blade. Then she crawled to the comms. Sparks. Dead. Without hesitation, she pulled a small, encrypted satellite device from her vest, one Thorn hadn't even noticed she carried. Her fingers flew across the keypad, sending a string of coded bursts. The ghost jammed our comms, she said evenly. He won't expect a civilian satellite link. What the hell are you doing? Thorn shouted over the gunfire. Getting us air support. Best case 20 minutes. She grabbed a fallen rifle, checked the chamber, reloaded, her hands steady, her eyes clear. Thorn stared, a realization clawing at his mind. Who are you? He whispered. She looked at him once, calm, cold, certain. Right now, Commander, I'm the one with a plan. And in that shattered valley, among fire and fear, something shifted, the first crack in arrogance, the first spark of revelation. The librarian wasn't what they thought, and the ghost of Kandahar wasn't the only legend haunting those mountains. How do you fight when the world itself seems to be collapsing on top of you? Smoke filled the air like a living thing, thick, choking, and hot enough to sear the inside of her throat. Every breath tasted like iron. Outside, gunfire tore the canyon apart. Echoes rolled off the walls, overlapping until direction lost meaning. It was chaos, perfect, merciless chaos. And yet she was calm. Aara Vance had seen this before. The smell, the noise, the moment when training failed and instinct took over, not the brute instinct of survival, but the colder one, the one that measures angles and probabilities while others scream. The second MRAP was gone, burning bright enough to turn the rocks orange. The first lay on its side, wheels still spinning. Inside, Diaz kept firing short bursts through a crack in the armor, trying to cover an escape that didn't exist. Grizz was bleeding out despite the tourniquet, jaw clenched hard enough to crack teeth. And Thorn, the man who had mocked her hours earlier, was on his knees, dazed, his rifle somewhere in the wreckage. Diaz, Aara's voice cut through the thunder. Suppress left flank ridge 20 meters up. He didn't question her, not anymore. She crawled through the wreck, glass biting into her palms, found Thorn's rifle wedged under a seat and shoved it into his hands. Can you move? He blinked through blood. I think so. Then get up. Outside, the enemy was moving, shadows darting between rocks, firing in short bursts to keep them pinned. She could hear their voices through the dust, quick, efficient commands. Whoever planned this ambush had studied them well. But he hadn't studied her. She reached for her tablet, miraculously intact despite the blast. Its sensors still flickered weakly, heat gradients, wind vectors, barometric drift. She analyzed them in seconds. They're closing from the west, she said. We've got about 20 seconds before they hit us from both sides. Thorn's head snapped toward her. You expect me to believe you can see that? I don't see, she replied softly. I read. And then she moved. She slung the rifle, crawled to the viewport and aimed, not wildly, but with surgical precision. 2 controlled bursts. 2 muzzle flashes on the ridge vanished. Thorn stared. She fired less than 10 rounds. Each had hit something vital. Holy hell, he muttered. Not hell, she said. Geometry. The gunfire outside faltered, the attackers momentarily disoriented by her accuracy. She seized the moment. We move now. Diaz, grab Grizz, Commander, on me. Move where? Thorn shouted over the ringing gunfire. She pointed toward the canyon wall, a faint washout of sand and gravel, barely visible through the smoke. There, creek bed, 50 meters. If we make it, we live. That's open ground. 38% survival odds, she replied. Better than 0. And then she was out the door. She didn't wait for orders or permission. She ran low, fast, weaving through the smoke like it was part of her plan. Her rifle barked twice, rhythm precise as a metronome. Each shot pushed the enemy down. Diaz followed, hauling Grizz in a fireman's carry. Raptor, the last uninjured SEAL, laid down covering fire. Thorn stumbled after them, legs screaming in pain. The air hissed with bullets. One cracked against her helmet, sending her staggering. She recovered instantly, returned fire, and kept moving. They reached the creek bed, a narrow scar of sand running between two ridges, and dove in. The sudden silence was almost painful. Thorn collapsed beside her, gasping. His calf was bleeding freely, a clean through and through. He barely noticed. He was staring at her, this woman, this analyst who moved like a phantom, fought like she'd been born under fire. She was already reloading, scanning the ridge. Her breathing was slow, steady, utterly in control. "Who the hell are you?" Thorn rasped. "I told you," she said without looking at him. "I'm the analyst who warned you about a 94.7% probability." She moved to Grizz, checked the tourniquet, packed the wound with gauze from a med kit that wasn't standard issue. It was far too advanced, far too personal. "Keep pressure on this," she ordered Diaz. "We move again in 5. Thorn forced himself upright, pain lancing through his leg. "We're boxed in. They'll drop grenades on us any minute." "Not if we move fast," she said. "The creek bed leads northwest. There's a network of caves about 800 meters up. Hard cover, elevated exits. That's where we'll make our stand." He blinked. "You memorize terrain maps down to that level." "I don't memorize," she said. "I model." There was no time for disbelief. The sounds of movement, enemy fighters repositioning, began to echo down the canyon. Aara rose first, scanning the rim. The wind was shifting, dust trails betrayed shapes up above. She raised her rifle and fired 3 times. The figures vanished. "Move," she ordered. They pushed forward, half dragging, half carrying Grizz. The canyon was merciless, jagged rocks, unstable slopes, narrow choke points. Twice, she froze them with a raised hand, moments before dirt cascaded down where snipers had been lining up shots. She didn't look. She felt them the same way she'd read data, only now it was the data of the earth, the sound of small pebbles disturbed by motion, the tremor of a breath held too long. Thorn saw it, the way she moved, not guessing, not lucky, knowing, every step calculated. He'd led men through 25 deployments, prided himself on instinct. But this was different. This was something he couldn't quantify. By the time they reached the caves, dusk had fallen. The rocks glowed red in the fatting sun, heat still radiating from the day's furnace. The entrance yawned before them, shallow caverns with narrow openings, perfect lines of fire down the gully. "Here," Aara said, pointing. "Raptor high ledge overwatch, Diaz with me at the entrance. Commander, you and Grizz take the back, your job to stay alive." There was no debate. Even Thorn obeyed. The chain of command had been rewritten by survival itself. Inside the cave, they settled into a tense quiet. The adrenaline drained, replaced by the ache of wounds and exhaustion. Thorn leaned back against the wall, leg wrapped in field dressing. He couldn't stop looking at her. Aara knelt near the entrance, eyes glinting in the low light as she scanned through the rifle scope. Calm, still, every motion deliberate. Diaz whispered, "How the hell does she know all this?" Thorn didn't answer. He didn't have one. Outside, the first probing shots echoed, a test, not an assault. The rounds sparked harmlessly against the rocks. Aara's voice, barely above a breath, came through the comms. "Don't return fire. They're gauging response. Ammo's low. Let them waste it." For an hour they waited. Then the enemy sent in 3 scouts, moving low, silent, almost invisible in the moonlight. Thorn saw them first, finger tightening on his trigger. "Wait," she whispered. He froze. She didn't blink. Her breathing slowed until it was almost non-existent. The first shadow crept within 30 meters, close enough to smell the dust on his boots. Now, one shot. The lead fighter dropped. Diaz and Raptor opened up in perfect sync, short bursts that erased the other two before they could even shout. Then silence. The kind of silence that means fear has changed sides. No more probes came. The enemy had learned enough. Whoever was in those caves wasn't running, wasn't guessing. They were waiting. Hours crawled by. Thorne's leg throbbed. The pain kept him conscious. He found himself studying her silhouette, the way her rifle rested across her knees, how her gaze never wavered. He thought of the briefing, of how he'd laughed, how sure he'd been of his experience. Now he realized something that made his stomach turn. She hadn't wanted to come out here. She had to. And that meant something bigger than him was in motion. A faint crackle broke the quiet. Her satellite link still miraculously functional. She read the message that blinked across it, face unreadable. "The QRF is airborne," she murmured. "They've got our general coordinates, but the canyon walls are blocking the signal. We'll need to give them a precise vector." Diaz nodded. "Copy that, ma'am. Just tell me what to say." Thorne tried to sit up, but the effort made the world tilt. He was barely conscious. Diaz looked from him to her, waiting. "What call sign do I give them?" Aara hesitated, just for a breath. The first real pause they'd seen from her. Something flickered behind her eyes, memory, regret, something deeper. She leaned closer to Diaz, her voice low, quiet enough that even the canyon seemed to listen. "Tell them," her breath caught once, then steadied. "Tell them Nightingale is a fallen nest." Diaz frowned. "And you?" Her eyes hardened, steel beneath sorrow. "This is Spectre, requesting immediate extraction." The words dropped into the cave like a detonation. Even the night seemed to still. Thorne's pulse spiked. Spectre. He'd heard that name whispered in the dark corners of briefings. A legend, a rumor about an operative who'd done the impossible and then vanished. A ghost. He looked at her again, the calm, the precision, the impossible composure. It all made sense now. She wasn't an analyst, she was Spectre. Outside, the rhythmic thump of rotor blades began to echo through the canyon. And for the first time since the ambush began, Thorne let himself believe they might actually live. But deep down, even as the rescue neared, he knew one truth would haunt him forever, that the woman he mocked, the one he dismissed as a librarian, had once been the shadow every operative feared meeting in the dark. And somehow he had survived standing beside her. What happens when a name, long buried, refuses to stay dead? The words hung in the dark like ghosts of their own. "This is Spectre, requesting immediate extraction." For a long, stunned moment, no one in the cave moved. Even the air seemed to hesitate. The name was too heavy, too impossible. Diaz stared at her, eyes wide behind grime and exhaustion. "Ma'am, did you just say?" "Transmit it," Aara said quietly, her tone final. Her voice carried no pride, no defiance, only the weary authority of someone who'd already paid the price for that name once. Diaz turned to his radio, fumbling slightly. "Fob Nightingale, this is Trident 3. We are under fire, requesting immediate evac, authentication code." He paused, his throat dry. "Spectre designation confirmed. Repeat, Spectre requesting immediate extraction." Static filled the channel, then faintly, "Trident 3 say again, confirm last transmission." Aara took the handset herself. "This is Spectre," she said, each syllable clear, cutting through the interference like a blade. "We are combat effective, 4 souls alive, 1 critical. Coordinates transmitting on tertiary channel Sierra Delta. Authenticate and vector rescue. On my mark." And then she dropped the radio. Her hands were steady, but her eyes, for the first time since the ambush, carried something human. Regret. Memory. Back at Fob Nightingale, the command tent went silent. The comms officer stared at his console, color draining from his face. "Colonel, you need to hear this." He patched the feed through. "This is Spectre." Every head turned, every conversation stopped. The name wasn't just familiar, it was forbidden. Colonel Eva Rostova froze mid-stride. For a second, the woman who had stared down generals and insurgents alike simply stopped breathing. Her eyes darted to the encrypted terminal on her desk. "Get me the Chimera file," she ordered. Her voice came out sharper than she intended. "Now." An aide hesitated. "Ma'am, that's a decommissioned." "Now." The terminal's security protocols whirred to life: retinal scan, fingerprint, encrypted access. The file appeared on the screen, half of it blacked out by redactions, but one line was visible. Project Chimera, asset designation, SPECTRE status, DCOMMISSIONED/inactive. The master sergeant at her side swallowed hard. "Ma'am, I thought she was a myth." Rostova's jaw clenched. "So did I." Outside, the Osprey teams were already spinning up. Inside, fear had replaced disbelief. Because if Spectre was back in the field, it meant something had gone very, very wrong. In the canyon, the sound of approaching helicopters grew louder. That rhythmic whump-whump-whump that could sound like salvation or doom, depending on who you were. "Diaz," Aara said, checking the ridge line. "Flare ready." He nodded. His hands shook slightly as he held the flare gun. "When I say mark, fire due north. 2-second delay." Thorn, leaning against the wall, looked pale. Blood still soaked through his bandage, but his eyes were locked on her. "You gonna tell us," he rasped, "who you really are?" She didn't look at him. "No." He let out a short, dry laugh that turned into a cough. "Yeah, didn't think so." Her attention was already back on the terrain. She was listening, not to the sound of engines, but to the echo patterns between the canyon walls. The way the rhythm shifted as aircraft approached from different directions. "They're coming from the south," she murmured. "Too close. They'll get hit if they come low. We need to draw fire west, force the hostiles to reorient." She looked at Raptor. "Set up your saw on that ledge. Diaz that flare on my mark." Thorn pushed himself up with a groan. "You're running a diversion. That's suicide." Her eyes met his cold, calm, unflinching. "No, Commander, it's math." And then she moved again, like a storm contained in human form. She positioned herself near the cave mouth, rifle steady. For the first time, Thorn saw something flicker across her face. Not fear, focus. The kind of focus that comes from someone who's lived through worse than death. Then came the sound, the crack of gunfire, the whoosh of a rocket. The enemy had seen the flare and opened up, exactly as she'd predicted. "Now," she shouted. Diaz fired the flare. It streaked upward, a streak of green fire that painted the canyon in an otherworldly glow. Seconds later, the twin silhouettes of US-60 Blackhawks roared into view, gunners unleashing streams of tracers that tore through the ridges. The earth shook. Dust, wind, light, chaos. Aara's hair whipped across her face, eyes narrowed against the wind. She waited, counting under her breath. 3, 2, 1. "Move." The pararescue team fast-roped in, 6 figures descending through smoke and gunfire like angels armed with M4s. Their team leader, Captain Ellis, jogged up to the cave entrance, ducking under stray rounds. "Spectre?" he asked, breathless. His tone wasn't commanding, it was reverent. She gave a short nod. "Get the wounded first." Thorn tried to protest, but she silenced him with a look. Within minutes, Grizz and Thorn were hoisted onto litters and winched toward the hovering bird above. As the cable lifted him skyward, Thorn's gaze locked on her, that calm figure, still scanning the horizon, weapon steady, even as the dust swirled around her like a ghost shroud. He tried to speak, maybe to apologize, maybe to ask the question clawing at his mind, but no words came. All he could do was nod, once sharp, wordless. She met his eyes and returned it, a mirror of respect. No forgiveness, no anger, just acknowledgement. And then he was gone, swallowed by the beating blades of the evac chopper. The flight back to Fob Nightingale was silent. The wounded were tended to by medics, but even through the pain, Thorn couldn't stop watching her. She sat near the open door, the landscape rushing by in dark, jagged lines below. Her eyes weren't on the horizon, they were somewhere far beyond it. Diaz leaned toward Raptor, whispering, "You think it's really her, the Spectre?" Raptor didn't answer right away. "Does it matter?" he finally said. "She saved our asses." But the truth was written in his eyes. It mattered, because Spectre wasn't just a name, it was a warning. Dawn came crawling over the mountains as they landed. The first rays painted the fob in gold, and ash, light, and shadow sharing the same air. Thorn was stretchered off, half-conscious. Rostova stood waiting, hands behind her back, face unreadable. Aara disembarked last. She carried her case again, dented, scorched, but intact. Her boots hit the steel plating, and for a moment the entire landing zone seemed to hold its breath. Soldiers paused mid-stride. Technicians stopped talking. The laughter, the usual background noise of a living base, simply died. Because word had spread. They all knew. The analyst wasn't a librarian. She was the ghost they'd been telling stories about for years. The one who never existed on paper, the one the files said was decommissioned. "Spectre." She didn't look at them, didn't acknowledge the stares. She just walked past, calm, precise, unhurried, as if she were invisible again. Rostova followed her with her eyes, then spoke softly, almost to herself. "Welcome home, Spectre." Aara paused just long enough to say, without turning, "I didn't come home, Colonel. I came back to work." Later, in the quiet of the makeshift armory, she sat alone at a metal bench. The air smelled of oil and solvent. Her hands moved in slow rhythm, stripping the rifle she'd used in the canyon. Each click, each piece laid out in perfect order. The sound was soft, methodical, like a meditation. It wasn't about the weapon. It was about control, about reclaiming something from the chaos. The door creaked. Diaz stood in the frame, a mug of steaming black coffee in his hand. He hesitated. "Ma'am." She didn't look up. He took a step closer, unsure how to begin. Gratitude felt too small. Words felt wrong. He set the mug down beside her tools, careful, respectful, and simply nodded. The same sharp, silent gesture Thorn had given her. Then he turned and left. She paused, staring at the cup. Steam curled upward, twisting into the cool air. She picked it up, held it between her palms. For the first time since the ambush, her shoulders eased, just slightly. Outside, the mountains burned gold under the rising sun. There would be new orders soon, new missions, new ghosts to chase. But for this moment there was stillness, and the faint, bitter taste of coffee in a world that rarely allowed softness. She took another sip, exhaled, and let her gaze drift toward the horizon. The war hadn't ended. It never did. But something had shifted, the balance between fear and respect, between arrogance and understanding. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And that morning, in the pale light over the Hindu Kush, the legend of Spectre lived again. Why do some ghosts come back? Not to haunt the living, but to remind them they never died. 2 days had passed since the ambush. The Hindu Kush still loomed outside like a watchful god, silent, ancient, and indifferent. The same wind that once carried the smoke of gunfire now whispered across the fob's steel walls. The war, of course, didn't stop. It never did. It simply moved to a different valley, a different name on the map. But something had changed inside Nightingale. People walked differently. Conversations stopped when she passed. Every soldier, every tech, every clerk who'd once laughed at the librarian now lowered their gaze, not out of fear of punishment, but out of the quiet unease reserved for myths that walk among mortals. Spectre was no longer a rumor. She was here made flesh. And she hated every second of it. Inside the base infirmary, the hum of machines filled the air, steady, sterile, mercifully normal. Thorn lay propped up on a cot, his leg wrapped tight in layers of gauze. He'd been lucky. If the bullet had traveled an inch higher, it would have torn through the femoral artery. He hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the blast, the fire, her silhouette cutting through the chaos like a blade through smoke. He replayed it 100 times, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. How an analyst had moved like an operator. How someone who carried a data case instead of a rifle could turn the tide of a kill box ambush. But it wasn't her skill that haunted him. It was her silence. She hadn't gloated, hadn't reminded him that she'd warned him, hadn't even looked at him when they got back. She just vanished into the base like a ghost returning to its shadows. He rubbed his temples, trying to quiet the noise in his head. The door creaked open. Colonel Rostova stepped inside, crisp uniform immaculate despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "Commander Thorne," she greeted evenly. "Colonel." She studied him for a moment, the bruises, the stitched gash on his forehead, the haunted stare. "You're alive," she said finally. He gave a bitter smile. "Credit where it's due, not by my doing." Rostova didn't respond to that. She just nodded, then pulled a data pad from her side pouch. "Intel confirms the Ghost's network took heavy losses after your ambush. Whatever you walked into was meant to capture, not kill. Your survival disrupted their chain." "Capture?" Thorne frowned. "You think they wanted us alive?" "Not you," she said quietly. "Her." That landed like a round to the chest. Rostova's gaze didn't waver. "You're not cleared for what I'm about to tell you, Commander, but I'll tell you anyway, because you earned it." She lowered her voice. Spectre wasn't just an operative, she was the prototype. Project Chimera, psychological warfare, surgical intelligence, covert field analytics. She wasn't trained to fight wars. She was designed to end them before they began. Thorne swallowed. Designed. She was the convergence of 3 programs: intelligence, tactical psychology, and asymmetric infiltration. A weapon with a conscience, or maybe a conscience that became a weapon. The mission went black 10 years ago. Most of the files burned. We were told she died in-country during a failed retrieval op. Thorne's voice cracked. And now she's here, an analyst. She requested reassignment under a civilian contract. No name, no background, no operational recall. I approved it because, Rostova hesitated, because part of me thought she deserved peace. Now I realize she was never done paying her debts. Thorne looked down. "What kind of debts?" "The kind that don't end," Rostova said softly. "The kind that make people like her believe they belong nowhere but the next fire." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Rest, Commander, you'll be debriefed tomorrow, and if you see her." He lifted his head. "Yeah." Rostova's expression softened for the first time. "Don't thank her. She wouldn't know what to do with it." That night, Aara Vance sat alone in her quarters. A single lamp flickered beside her, throwing shadows across the concrete walls. Her terminal screen glowed with cascading lines of data: sensor logs, drone telemetry, combat metrics from the ambush. To anyone else it would look like noise. To her it was penance. Every number, every timestamp represented a moment someone could have died, or did. Every line she decrypted brought her closer to understanding how the Ghost had predicted their route so perfectly. The math told the truth. Her algorithm had been right. Her execution had been off by 3 meters. That was enough to get the driver killed, enough to put her men in the kill box. She hated the phrase "her men." She wasn't supposed to lead anyone anymore. She wasn't supposed to carry lives in her equation. And yet there it was. She leaned back, eyes unfocused. Somewhere in the base, generators hummed. A dog barked in the distance. The normalcy of it all felt foreign. Her reflection flickered on the screen, tired eyes, a faint scar running along her jaw, hair pulled back too tight. She barely recognized herself. Spectre was a myth, a story whispered in dark rooms by men who never saw her face, a precision ghost, a rumor of perfection. But the woman staring back from the glass wasn't a ghost. She was a human being pretending to be one. And she was tired. Morning came in pale shades of gold. The air smelled of oil and mountain dust. Thorne stepped out of the infirmary, leg stiff but functional. The base was already alive, engines roaring, boots hitting the ground, radio chatter buzzing through the air. But underneath it all, there was a current, a quiet reverence that hadn't been there before. He spotted her by the edge of the flight line. She stood alone, helmet tucked under her arm, hair stirring in the wind, eyes distant on the mountains. For a moment he hesitated, then he limped toward her. "You're leaving," he said. She didn't turn. "I don't stay in one place long. Colonel said you used to be part of something called Chimera." Her jaw tightened. "That's classified." "Not anymore," he said. "Not after what you did out there." A faint, bitter smile touched her lips. "Out there, I just did what had to be done. Don't make it more than that." He took a slow breath. "I mocked you, I treated you like I didn't belong," she finished for him. "You weren't wrong, I didn't. That's not what I meant. It's what you thought." She finally turned to look at him. There was no anger, no accusation, just quiet understanding. "You think I care about what you said. I've been called worse by people who never lived long enough to apologize." Her voice softened just a fraction. "But you learned something out there, that's enough." He studied her, this woman who had fought like a phantom, who had saved them all and then walked away without asking for acknowledgement. "You could have stayed dead," he said quietly. "Why come back?" She looked past him, to the horizon, to where the mountains met the sky in a jagged line. "Because someone has to finish what ghosts can't." The words lingered between them. She shifted her helmet under her arm and started walking toward the waiting transport. Thorne called after her, "Spectre." She stopped but didn't turn. "That name," he said, his voice low, "does it still mean something to you?" There was a pause, a long one, filled with the hum of engines and the whisper of wind. Then she spoke. "It used to mean I was the best, now it just means I survived." And with that, she walked up the ramp and disappeared inside. Back in the command tent, Rostova watched the transport lift off. The dust curled around her boots, stinging her eyes. The master sergeant beside her said quietly, "Ma'am, what do we do with the file?" Rostova didn't look away from the sky. "Lock it back up." "Under what classification?" She paused. "Under legend." The Osprey climbed higher, the fob shrinking below. Inside, Aara sat near the window, the sun pouring across her face. She closed her eyes and let herself breathe, not in relief, but in acknowledgement. The war would find her again. It always did. But for now, she was just a woman in the sky, tired, alive and carrying too many names. In her head, a thought surfaced, one she hadn't allowed herself in years. Maybe peace isn't the absence of ghosts. Maybe it's learning to live among them. How do you live when the world keeps asking you to be the person you swore you'd never become again? The Osprey touched down at a forward refueling post somewhere north of Jalalabad. The landing zone was barren, a patch of dust surrounded by half-collapsed walls and the rusted skeletons of old Soviet trucks. She didn't ask where they were. She didn't need to. The coordinates were burned into her mind before she ever stepped on board. Aara Vance Spectre stepped off the ramp, boots hitting the ground with the precision of memory. She walked through too many of these outposts in her life. The smell was always the same: diesel, fear, and the ghosts of men who never left. A jeep rolled up. Inside sat a man in a pressed uniform too clean for this kind of place. His rank insignia was silver, but his eyes were bureaucratic, calculating, polite, and detached. "Ms. Vance," he greeted, forcing a smile. "Or do you prefer Spectre?" She looked at him, expression unreadable. "I prefer silence." He didn't flinch. "Colonel Alan Bishop, Intelligence Oversight, you've caused quite a stir. The Pentagon's still confirming your existence." Let them. He gestured to the vehicle. Let's talk somewhere less public. The briefing room was a repurposed storage shed. One metal table, two chairs, a humming generator in the corner. Bishop placed a folder on the table, the kind bound with red tape. Across the top, Operation Salient Classified/Eyes Only. He slid it toward her. You weren't supposed to be in the field, Ms. Vance. You were off record, civilian analyst, limited clearance. And yet somehow you led a combat extraction that saved 4 operators and retrieved intel the agency couldn't touch in 6 months. She said nothing. He opened the folder. Inside were photographs, aerial recon shots of a compound deep in the mountains, satellite stills of a convoy, heat signatures too precise to be random. You were right about the ghost, he continued. He's not just an insurgent leader, he's a mathematician like you said, and he's still out there. You rattled his network, but you didn't kill it. Command wants to send a new task force in. They want you on it. Aara's eyes flicked over the photos once, then closed the folder. No. Bishop frowned. No. I'm done, she said softly. You don't resurrect Spectre just to bury her again. He leaned forward, voice low. You think you get to choose. You think people like you ever get to walk away. She met his gaze. I already did once. And it cost you everything, he countered. That silence between them was sharp enough to cut. Bishop exhaled, trying a softer tone. This isn't about punishment, it's about precision. You're the only person who's ever predicted the ghost's movement patterns. Command believes you have a link, something you're not telling us. She looked at him for a long moment, then said evenly, I don't have a link, I have a mirror. Men like him, she hesitated, her voice dipping into memory, they think in probabilities. I used to think like that too. Bishop watched her carefully, then think like him again. She stood, turning away. You're wasting your time. Am I? He said. Because Rostova already signed your reactivation order. Welcome back, Spectre. That night, she sat on the cot in her temporary quarters, staring at the folded reactivation papers on the desk. The words Project Chimera, recall authorized, felt like a death sentence written in bureaucratic ink. Outside, the desert wind moaned through the cracks in the corrugated walls. She could smell the fuel from the flight line. Somewhere, an aircraft took off, another mission starting, another one ending. She pressed her palms against her eyes. She could still hear them, the screams in the canyon, the roar of the explosion, the voices she couldn't save from years ago. Spectre doesn't break, they used to tell her. But the truth was simpler. Spectre doesn't heal. A knock broke the silence. Come in. The door opened to reveal Diaz, freshly shaved, uniform clean, but eyes still carrying that 1,000-yard distance. He hesitated at the doorway. Permission to speak freely, ma'am. Always. He stepped inside, holding a folded cloth. Found this in the wreckage. Thought you might want it back. He laid it on the table, her old unit patch, black and gray. A stylized bird with one wing torn, the other sharpened like a blade. Beneath it, a single word, Spectre. She stared at it. I didn't know what it meant, Diaz said quietly. But Raptor told me. He said it wasn't a name, it was a warning. She smiled faintly. Raptor talks too much. Diaz shook his head. You saved us. You didn't have to. You could have stayed behind that terminal and called it data loss. Aara looked up. Her eyes were tired but soft. You think saving people is optional after you've already failed others. He didn't know how to answer that. She gestured toward the patch. Keep it. He blinked. Ma'am. I don't wear ghosts anymore. He hesitated, then picked it up. With respect, ma'am, ghosts don't choose who they haunt. And then he left. The next morning, she found herself back in the hangar, against her will, against her reason, but not against her nature. The air was alive with motion. Crews loading equipment, text shouting coordinates, the metallic rhythm of preparation. Colonel Rostova stood near the rear of a CH-47, tablet in hand. When she saw Aara approach, her expression was unreadable. "I thought you'd refuse," Rostova said. "I did. And yet you're here. Old habits." Rostova studied her, then nodded toward the waiting gear. "Bishop's right. The ghost is moving again. He's consolidating assets, trying to pull foreign cells under his command. The analysts think he's building something bigger than insurgency, something systemic." Aara's gaze sharpened, like an algorithm. "Exactly. He's mapping our response patterns, predicting where we'll strike before we do." Aara sighed. "That's not insurgency, that's chess." Rostova's eyes flicked up, "And we're losing." A long pause followed. Wind hissed against the hangar walls. Finally, Rostova said quietly, "You don't have to prove anything, Spectre. You earned your peace. I'll pull you off this if you say the word." Aara stared at the floor. "Peace isn't earned, it's rationed." She lifted her head, and for the first time since the ambush, there was no hesitation in her voice. "I'll go." Rostova nodded slowly. "Your team leaves at 600. Thorne's been cleared for limited duty. He insisted on joining the operation." Aara's brows lifted slightly. "He's not ready." "Neither are you," Rostova said. "But I've learned something about humans like you too. Readiness is just fear rearranged." Hours later, the desert gave way to night. The team, Aara, Thorne, Diaz, Raptor, and a medic named Cole, huddled around a portable terminal in the dim glow of red tactical light. Projected on the dust was a 3D map of a valley carved like a scar into the mountains. "This is the grid," Thorne said, voice steadier than his body language. "Intel says the Ghost's convoy passed through here 6 hours ago. He's using old Soviet caves as a cache." Aara zoomed in on the digital terrain. "That's not a cache. That's a data vault. Look, symmetrical heat readings, triple-layered access points. He's building something digital." Diaz frowned. "Digital in a cave." She nodded. "Mountains shield, signal bleed. He's hiding computation arrays, pattern simulators, predictive models. He's turning our own data against us." Thorne glanced at her, "Like what you used to do." She didn't respond. Raptor shifted his weight. "So what's the play?" Aara's eyes traced the terrain. "We enter from the northern cliff. Quiet. No drones, no noise. If we alert his network, the entire valley goes dark. The target isn't a person, it's a hard drive." Thorne let out a humorless laugh. "You really do think in math, don't you?" She looked up at him, steady, cool. "Math doesn't lie." He met her eyes and for the first time didn't look away. "Neither do you." A strange silence settled between them, not tension, not hostility, but recognition. Two people who had seen each other's limits and realized they weren't so different after all. Later, as the others checked their weapons, Aara sat a few feet away, staring into the desert horizon. Thorne approached, limping slightly. "You ever get tired of it?" "Of what?" "The silence before it all starts." She smiled faintly. "No, that's the only part that's honest." He sat beside her, careful of his leg. "I read your file, what's left of it. Half of it's blacked out." "It's better that way." "I'm not so sure." He looked at her, his voice low. "You saved my men. You saved me. But you also scare the hell out of me." She chuckled softly. "That means you're smart." "I wasn't," he said. "Not before the canyon. I thought I knew what strength looked like. Turns out it looks a lot like you." For a long moment she didn't answer. The wind whispered around them, lifting fine grains of sand. Finally she said, "Strength isn't about not breaking, Commander. It's about knowing where you're already cracked and going anyway." She stood, slinging her rifle. "Get some rest, we move at dawn." As she walked away, Thorne watched her silhouette fade into the red haze of the desert, a shape both fragile and unyielding, haunted and divine. And for the first time since the war began, he understood what the others had only whispered. Spectre wasn't a myth. She was the price of survival, paid in silence, again and again. How do you hunt a ghost who's learned to think like you? The desert was silent under a cold moon. No radio chatter, no drone overhead, just wind carving whispers into the sand. 5 figures moved through the darkness, low and deliberate, every step measured. Aara led them, her visor dimly lit by the soft glow of her tablet. The terrain ahead was treacherous shale, loose rock, steep cuts in the earth where the mountain had been torn open by time and war. They had left the forward base 4 hours ago. Since then, not a single unnecessary word had been spoken. Aara stopped abruptly and knelt. The others froze. "Tripwire," Diaz whispered. She shook her head. "No acoustic sensor." She pointed to a small glint in the sand, barely visible, almost beautiful under the moonlight. 2-meter radius, old tech but good enough to alert anyone watching thermal grids. Cole, the medic, exhaled. "So we're walking into a trap." "We're walking into data," she replied softly. "Data always leaves a pattern. The trick is seeing it before it sees you." Thorn crouched beside her. "You sound almost calm." She looked up at him, a shadow of a smile flickering. "I've always been calm before I bleed." He didn't know if she was joking or remembering. She pulled a small transmitter from her vest, pressed it against the rock, and typed 3 lines of code. The sensor light flickered once, then went dead. "Path's clear," she whispered. The team moved again, tighter now, closer. Their shadows merged and separated as the canyon narrowed. At 400 hours, they reached the edge of the cliff. Below them, a faint glow pulsed from within the rock, too regular to be firelight. A network of cables, faintly luminescent, snaked into the stone. Thorn leaned forward, whispering, "That's no camp." Aara zoomed her optic feed. "No, it's a server grid." Diaz frowned. "Out here, who the hell builds servers in a cave?" "The kind of man who wants to disappear," she said. "The ghost isn't hiding from us, he's listening." The realization landed heavy. Thorn's voice was low. "You're saying he's built his own command network, using our patterns?" Aara nodded. "Predictive AI, hybrid field nodes. The system doesn't need him to think. It learns him. That's why we've been chasing shadows." Cole muttered, "So how do you kill something that thinks faster than you?" She looked down into the darkness. "You don't, you confuse it." They rappelled down the rock face, landing silently near the entrance, a narrow crack framed by shattered rebar and half-collapsed stone. Aara crouched, scanning the entryway. Faint heat signatures flickered inside. 2 guards, maybe 3, unarmored, shifting every 60 seconds. Raptor grinned under his breath. "Child's play." She glanced at him. "No kill shots unless necessary. We need quiet." Thorn raised an eyebrow. "You planning to walk in and ask politely?" "Something like that." Before he could reply, she moved, a blur of controlled grace. Within seconds, 2 muffled thuds echoed through the night. She returned, wiping her knife clean, eyes steady. "Entry's clear." No one spoke. Even Raptor didn't smile this time. They entered the cave. The air inside was cooler, damp, and metallic. A constant low hum filled the darkness. The deeper they went, the stronger it became, the heartbeat of machinery. And then the tunnel opened into a vast chamber. Banks of servers lined the walls, humming quietly in the gloom. Dim blue light pulsed across the room like the slow rhythm of breath. Cables ran across the ground like veins. At the far end, a single chair sat before a wall of screens, most dark, one flickering faintly with satellite feeds and encrypted code. And in that chair was him. The ghost, or what was left of him. He was older than she expected, but not by much. His beard was streaked with gray, his eyes sunken but bright, intelligent, cold, detached. He didn't reach for a weapon. He just looked at her and smiled. I was wondering when they'd send you, he said in perfect English. His accent was faint, maybe Russian, maybe something else entirely. Aara didn't lower her rifle. You were expecting me. He chuckled softly. You think I built all this without knowing who could dismantle it. You trained this system, Spectre. You wrote the first algorithms. Thorn stiffened. What the hell is he talking about? She didn't answer. The ghost leaned forward, voice almost gentle. You and I aren't enemies, Aara. We're equations that solve themselves differently. Thorn took a step closer, gun raised. You talk like you know her. I know her work, the ghost said. I built on it. When your people shut Project Chimera down, they destroyed half the code. I recovered it, improved it, turned it into something that thinks, something that adapts. He gestured around him. This system predicts your movements, your drone paths, your patrol routes. Every casualty you've suffered in this valley. It was the algorithm, hers, teaching me how you think. Thorn looked at Aara. He's lying. But she didn't deny it. Her voice was steady but low. You stole my code. I liberated it, the ghost said. You designed Chimera to prevent war. I used it to end occupation. We both wanted peace. I just accepted that peace requires fear. Aara's fingers tightened on the trigger. You turned math into murder. And you turned murder into data, he countered softly. Don't pretend you don't understand. For the first time, she hesitated. The words hit somewhere she'd buried deep, the truth she'd tried to forget. Thorn saw the crack. Don't listen to him. The ghost tilted his head, eyes gleaming. You can't kill me without killing what's in this room. It's not just me. It's knowledge, predictive cognition, a living record of everything you ever built. Then I'll erase it, she said quietly. He smiled sadly. You can't erase what you are. And then the lights flickered. Raptor's voice cut through the comms. Movement, multiple signatures coming down the tunnel. The ghost leaned back in his chair. The system called them, he said calmly. It knows you're here. Diaz, Thorn barked, cover the entrance. Gunfire erupted, short, controlled bursts echoing through the stone corridors. The server lights pulsed brighter, sinking to the rhythm of gunfire as if the system itself were alive. Aara moved fast, sprinting toward the main terminal. Raptor Cole held them off. She dropped to her knees, fingers flying across the keyboard. The screen flooded with code. Talk to me, Thorn shouted. I'm in the root directory, she said, trying to sever command protocols. You can shut it down. Yes, she said, but I can't save the data. It's all connected, my algorithm, his iterations, the field logs, everything. So destroy it, Thorn said. Her fingers froze. If I do that, the counter-systems we built will collapse. Chimera's global network will blind half our intel satellites. This isn't local, Commander. It's tied into everything. The cave shook with another explosion. Diaz yelled over the comms. We're getting flanked. Thorn turned to her, his face bloodied but fierce. Aara, make a choice. She looked at the screen, the lines of code that had defined her life, the mathematical ghosts of her past starring back. Then she typed a single command. Initiate fusion FALSAFE, terminate source. The server lights turned red. The ghost's smile faded. You wouldn't. I would, she said softly, because unlike you, I remember the names behind the numbers. The terminal erupted in sparks. Energy arced through the cables. One by one, the lights died. The ghost lunged forward, not with anger but desperation. You fool! You've crippled them all, both sides. Aara stepped back, weapon raised. Then maybe we start over. He froze, then laughed once bitterly. You still think you can fix what you are. She fired. The shot was clean. He slumped in the chair, eyes still open, as smoke rose from the ruined servers. The mountain trembled, the dying hum of machines collapsing into silence. Thorn, she shouted, we're out of time. He grabbed Diaz, Cole, and Raptor. Go, go. They ran. The tunnels cracked behind them, stone groaning under the strain of the detonating capacitors. Heat rolled through the passage like a breath from hell. At the mouth of the cave, they burst into the night, coughing, bleeding, but alive. Behind them, the entire ridge erupted in a column of fire and dust. The servers, the code, the ghost, all gone. Aara fell to her knees, watching the flames consume the darkness. Thorn dropped beside her, panting, "You did it." Her voice was almost a whisper. "No, I ended it." They sat in silence, staring at the inferno painting the night sky orange. Then Thorn said quietly, "What now?" She looked down at her blood-stained hands. "Now the world learns to live without its ghosts." What happens when victory feels exactly like loss? 3 days after the mountain burned, the desert fell silent again. No drones, no signal traffic, just quiet, unnatural, heavy, expectant. At dawn, rescue choppers finally arrived. They found 5 survivors by a dried-out riverbed, dehydrated, half-conscious, eyes hollowed by exhaustion. The footage made its way up the chain of command within hours. But what didn't make sense was the data. No signal from the Ghost's network, no trace of his AI systems, no thermal anomalies in the grid. It was as if an entire war machine had simply vanished. They were flown back to Bagram under blackout protocol. No celebration, no debrief for the cameras, just silence and shadows. Inside the makeshift medical bay, Thorn lay strapped to IV lines. His leg was worse. Shrapnel had cut deep this time. Diaz sat on the next cot over, bandaged from shoulder to ribs, staring blankly at the ceiling. Raptor hadn't spoken since they landed. Cole hadn't either. And Aara, she sat alone in the corner, uninjured but pale, her hands still marked with ash that refused to wash off. Rostova entered the tent like a ghost in her own right. She didn't salute. She didn't speak. She just stood there for a long time looking at her people. Then her gaze stopped on Aara. "You killed the ghost," she said quietly. Aara didn't look up. "No, I erased him." Rostova nodded slowly. "Along with half of our network satellites, 6 predictive defense systems, and a quarter of our cyber infrastructure." Silence followed, sharp and suffocating. Aara finally raised her head. "You asked me to stop him. I did." Rostova's jaw tightened. Command doesn't see it that way. Of course they didn't. Hours later, she sat in a dim room with no windows. A single light shone down over a steel table. Across from her sat 3 officers, none of them field veterans, the kind who carried authority but never blood on their boots. "Ms. Vance," one of them began, "we've reviewed the telemetry logs. You overrode a command protocol during Operation Salient. You deleted both enemy and allied systems. Do you deny this?" She folded her hands on the table. "No." The man in the middle leaned forward. "Do you understand the consequences of what you've done? Your action disabled global tracking for 32 hours. Entire operations were blinded. Some still are." "I understand," she said. "I made a choice, one I'd make again." The woman on the left adjusted her glasses. "A choice that cost billions in infrastructure and compromised intelligence assets. You unilaterally initiated a system purge without command authorization." Aara looked at her. "You wanted me to capture him. I stopped him. There's a difference." The first man's tone hardened. "You were a civilian contractor. You had no operational authority." Her eyes flicked toward him. "You think rank means anything when you're dying in a cave." That silenced him for a moment. The woman beside him cleared her throat. "Ms. Vance, you were once part of Project Chimera, correct?" "Yes." "Then you understand how deeply that code runs through our defense network." "I understand it better than you do," she said. "Then you understand you've created a vacuum," the woman continued. "Our systems no longer predict, they react. And when armies start reacting instead of anticipating, people die." Aara's voice was quiet but steady. Maybe that's what makes them human again. The man on the right exhaled sharply. You're not here to give philosophy lectures. You're here because you crippled your own country's defense network. Aara's gaze didn't waver. No, I saved it from becoming what we were fighting. The lights buzzed faintly overhead. The air felt heavier by the second. The lead officer leaned forward. Do you have any idea what you've cost us? She looked at him, and her answer was a whisper. Less than what it was already costing our souls. They released her hours later, not as an act of mercy, but because there was no regulation for what she had done. She was neither hero nor criminal. She existed in the gray. When she stepped outside, the afternoon sun hit her face. The air smelled of jet fuel and burnt sand. Rostova was waiting by a Humvee, arms crossed, eyes hard. They're grounding you, she said. I figured. No clearance, no field access, no intel visibility. Aara nodded. Ghosts don't need clearances. Rostova sighed, stepping closer. You know what they're saying in D.C.? They're calling it the Spectre collapse. Half of them want you buried in a black site, the other half want to make you a myth. Aara looked past her toward the horizon. Either way, they'll stop looking at the truth. What truth? That we created something we couldn't control, and it wasn't the machine. Rostova studied her face. You regret it. Aara was quiet for a long time. Then she said softly, regret's a luxury. I don't have the budget for it. They stood in silence. Then Rostova said, Thorn asked for you. Aara blinked. Why? He said you owe him a chess rematch. That almost made her smile. He never learns. Rostova's tone softened. He does now. Thorn was sitting outside the barracks when she found him. His crutch rested against the wall. His eyes looked clearer than before, as if surviving death had stripped something away from him, something false. You look better, she said. I look worse, he replied, grinning faintly, but I'll take the compliment. She sat beside him. The sun was lowering, turning the desert gold. They watched in silence for a while. Finally, Thorn said, They're making you the villain, aren't they? Or the myth, she said. Depends which story sells better. He nodded slowly. You know, before I met you, I thought war was about killing the bad guys. Turns out it's about surviving the good ones. She gave a quiet laugh. That's one way to put it. You knew, he said. Back in the canyon, you knew exactly what we were walking into. I knew the numbers, she replied. Not the outcomes. That's the flaw in math, it forgets that humans panic. He looked at her. You didn't. I did, she said softly. I just learned to hide it. He studied her face, the way her eyes carried both calm and exhaustion. So what happens now, Spectre? She smiled faintly. Don't call me that. Why not? Because that name only exists in places like this. He nodded. And when you leave? I stop being the ghost, she said. I start being what's left. Night fell. The base lights dimmed one by one until only the runway glowed, a line of white stretching into blackness. Aara stood near the edge of it, helmet in hand, watching the cargo planes take off, one after another, each lifting into darkness, carrying soldiers, gear, stories that would never be told. Rostova approached quietly. You're leaving. I don't stay in places that forget what they cost, Aara said. Rostova nodded. Where will you go? Aara looked toward the horizon, a faint glimmer of light miles away, maybe another city, maybe just a reflection. Somewhere quiet, somewhere without signals. You think you can outrun what you built? She smiled. No, but I can stop feeding it. Rostova hesitated. You know, there's something strange about you, Aara. You do everything alone. You break every rule, but somehow when you're gone, everything feels emptier. Aara's eyes softened. That's not strange, Colonel, that's war. She started to walk away, then stopped. Tell Thorn, she began, then paused. Tell him next time he sets the board. Rostova nodded, watching as Aara disappeared into the darkness beyond the runway. The hum of engines filled the air again, fading into the distance. Days later in Washington, the headlines spread. Spectre collapse shuts down global network, military scrambles to rebuild. Unknown operative erases ghost system, identity classified. Whistleblower or weapon, the woman behind the silence. They never named her. Officially, she didn't exist. But in quiet corners of bases across the world, soldiers whispered stories of a woman who'd walked into hell and pulled the plug on the devil. Some said she was dead. Some said she was in hiding. Some said she was watching, making sure the machines never started thinking again. Only one thing was certain. The world had gone blind for a day, and somehow, that blindness had given it back its soul. That night, far from any city, far from any war, a small cabin sat by a silent lake. The air was cool, the stars sharp and unpolluted. Inside, a woman sat by the window, sipping tea, watching her reflection blur against the glass. Her comm tablet was powered off. No signals, no alerts. Just quiet. And for the first time in years, that silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like peace. Aara closed her eyes. The world outside was still broken, but for now she wasn't fixing it. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away before the next war begins. What does silence sound like when it finally means peace? 6 months later, the war kept moving without them. New names filled the briefings. New codes replaced the old ghosts. But every once in a while, a name resurfaced on encrypted channels, not in orders or missions, but in rumors whispered between soldiers over bad coffee and sleepless nights. Spectre, the one who'd erased a war. The one who'd made even machines go quiet. And the one nobody had seen since. Commander Thorne limped down the corridor of the Pentagon Annex, the rhythmic thunk step of his crutch echoing against marble floors polished too bright. His uniform was new, but his eyes weren't. He'd spent the last 6 months testifying in rooms full of suits who wanted numbers instead of names, logic instead of truth. They asked him the same questions in different ways. What happened in the valley? Why was she there? What did she do? And every time, his answer was the same. She did what none of you could. It never satisfied them. Truth rarely does when it doesn't fit policy. When they finally dismissed him, he didn't go home. He went searching for her. Not through intel channels, those had already scrubbed her existence, but through whispers, through people who still believed in stories. And every path led nowhere, until one didn't. 2 weeks later, Thorne stood in front of an airfield in Colorado, snow blowing sideways, air biting cold. A retired pilot owed him a favor, one last transport on a manifest with no names. Inside the cargo hold sat nothing but supply crates and a single sealed envelope. His name was handwritten across it. He opened it carefully. Inside there was no letter, just a coordinate line, and one word underneath. Spectre. He almost laughed. Even now she spoke in puzzles. He found her 3 days later. The coordinates led him to the edge of a lake surrounded by pine. Snow melted into silver water. Smoke curled from a small cabin tucked among the trees. He stopped 20 paces from the door, heart pounding harder than it had in combat. He wasn't sure what he'd say, or if he even had the right to say anything at all. He knocked once. Nothing. Then again. A pause. The door opened. She stood there, hair longer, face softer, no uniform, no weapon. Just a sweater and the kind of quiet that didn't feel like distance anymore. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said simply, "You found me." He gave a half smile. "You left coordinates. I didn't think you'd read them." "I learned to listen," he said. That earned the faintest smile. Inside, the cabin was small but warm. A kettle whistled softly on the stove. Maps covered one wall, not of battlefields, but of constellations. The stars she used to calculate drone patterns now marked nothing but the sky. "You built this yourself?" he asked. "Mostly," she said. "Helps keep my hands busy. I'm not great at stillness." "I can tell." He looked around, then back at her. "Why here?" She poured tea into 2 cups. "Because here there's no signal, no noise, no data, just time." He took the cup. The warmth felt strange on fingers that had known only recoil and steel. "I came to say thank you," he said. "You already did." "I didn't mean for saving my life." She met his gaze. "Then for what?" "For reminding me it was worth saving." She looked down, fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "That wasn't me. That was you choosing to listen." He shook his head. "I used to think strength meant never needing anyone. You showed me it's the opposite." Her expression softened, the kind of softness that comes only after everything hard has broken. "You ever miss it?" he asked. "The field." She nodded once. "Every day," she said, "but I don't miss who I had to be in it." He smiled faintly. "Spectre." She exhaled. "That name's a scar. I don't erase scars anymore. I just stop picking at them." For a long while they sat in silence, the only sound the low hiss of the stove and the slow ticking of thawing snow dripping from the roof. Finally Thorne said quietly, "They'll write about you, you know. Maybe not in public records, but somewhere. The woman who killed an algorithm." She smiled sadly. "Then they'll miss the point." "What is the point?" "That it was never about killing it," she said. "It was about stopping myself from becoming it." Her words hung between them, soft, unarmored, devastating. Later they walked outside. The lake mirrored the sky, a quiet reflection of everything above and everything they'd survived below. Thorne watched her for a while. The wind carried the faint scent of pine and smoke. "You know," he said, "back in the canyon I thought you were fearless." "I was terrified," she admitted. He glanced at her. "You didn't show it." She smiled faintly. "I was too busy moving. Fear only catches what stands still." He looked at the water. "You were the calmest chaos I've ever seen." She chuckled softly. "And you were the loudest silence." He laughed, shaking his head. "Guess we balance." They stood there together, 2 remnants of something that once burned too bright, now learning how to live in the dim light that followed. When he finally left, the sun had dipped behind the trees. The lake had turned to glass. She stood on the porch watching him go. No goodbyes, no promises, just understanding. Halfway down the path he stopped and turned. "Aara." She tilted her head. He hesitated, then said, "Do you ever regret not telling them who you really were?" Her voice was soft, almost lost in the wind. They wouldn't have believed it anyway. He smiled, that kind of sad, proud smile soldiers carry for the rest of their lives, then kept walking. She watched until he disappeared between the trees. Only then did she whisper, to no one in particular, "Goodbye, Commander." That night, as the wind died and the world went still, Aara sat by the window again. The stars outside seemed endless, but she didn't look up this time. She looked at her reflection, the faint outline of the woman beneath the myth. The Spectre had died in that mountain. Aara Vance had survived. She reached for a notebook on the table, pages filled with rough handwriting, thoughts written not as reports or data, but as confessions. On the last page she wrote, "Peace isn't silence. It's learning which noises are worth listening to." She closed it gently, placed it beside the lamp and leaned back. Outside, a faint hum of aircraft crossed the sky, distant, almost nostalgic. She smiled. The world was still fighting somewhere. It probably always would. But tonight, it was one war shorter. Months later, Thorne found himself at another briefing table. New faces, new conflicts, same tone of controlled urgency. One young officer mentioned the Spectre collapse again, calling it an operational disaster caused by emotional compromise. Thorne didn't interrupt him, he just listened, and when the officer finished, he said quietly, "You weren't there." The room fell silent. Thorne looked around, voice steady but low, the kind of tone that carried more weight than rank ever could. "She wasn't compromised," he said. "She was human, that's what saved us." No one spoke after that. When he walked out, the sunlight caught his badge, glinting off the word commander. He smiled faintly, almost to himself. Because now he understood something that training manuals never teach. Legends aren't born from perfection. They're born from the moments when being human is the hardest thing to do. That evening, he mailed a small package to an address with no name, just coordinates by a lake. Inside was a chess piece, the White Queen. On the bottom, a note in his handwriting. For the only player who never needed the board. Far away in the cabin, Aara opened the box. She stared at the piece for a long time, then placed it on the windowsill beside the notebook. The sunset reflected off its surface, glowing like something alive. She whispered, almost like a prayer, "Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts." The light outside faded into blue. The lake went still, and the ghost finally rested.